So yeah, thank you very much. She said, my name is Douglas Wingate. I am a licensed acupuncturist, doctor in Chinese medicine, functional medicine, hyperbaric clinician, and we're not going to talk on any of that today. We're going to talk on what I consider a really fascinating subject that's kind of timely here in the state of Oregon, and it's also kind of arguably a controversial subject matter to touch on as well. So we are going to talk about psilocybin and some of the research that's been done in terms of increases in neuroplasticity and synaptogenesis. Uh, so why are we even discussing this? I'm going to see, I've got everybody's heads in the corner here. I'm going to see if I can minimize this for myself so that I can see a little bit more of the slides. There we go. Okay, so we are discussing psilocybin, and in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act made psilocybin illegal as a Schedule I substance. And the definition of a Schedule I substance is any substance that does not have any therapeutic value and is supposed to have a high risk of addiction. And we're going to touch on updated information on some of those things as we get into this presentation. But in 1970, but prior to 1970, there was a number of institutions, universities that were doing psychedelic research, and all of that kind of got halted as a result of this scheduling of psilocybin along with other psychedelic medicines. In 1997, however, in the University of Zurich, they started the first modern psilocybin research again. So they started conducting some research in 2018. The FDA in the United States granted Compass Pathways, a pharmaceutical company, what they call a breakthrough therapy designation for its use in addressing treatment-resistant depression. That's something that's currently in phase 2 FDA phase 2 trials. Breakthrough therapy is a title given when there is evidence that any particular therapeutic method is showing significant benefit over the existing therapeutic approaches that are out there. So it's not something that happens for a lot of drugs, and in this case, for psilocybin, it's happened twice. In 2019, the FDA granted the Sona Institute Breakthrough Therapy designation for the use of psilocybin in addressing major depressive disorder. This is also currently in the phase 2 trials, so being further evaluated in small treatment groups before moving into the final phase 3 trials that are necessary for any sort of FDA approval. Over the last few years, things have changed even more. So in 2020, Oregon voters passed Measure 109, and this legalized psilocybin for its therapeutic use in a clinical setting. It's now obviously 2023. That's not readily available for therapeutic use yet. What's happened is over the last couple years, the Oregon Health Authority has been putting together all of the rules and regulations and structure for this rollout for the legalization of psilocybin. In 2021, the National Institute of Health federally funded psilocybin research at Johns Hopkins University in collaboration with the University of Alabama at Birmingham and New York University for smoking addiction. So this is just the getting funding from the National Institute of Health is just another step in terms of, okay, individual companies were granted ability to do research, and now we have the National Institute of Health federally funding these studies and this research. In 2022, the Oregon Health Authority approves the first psilocybin facilitator training programs. So that was about mid-year last year. They had set most of the tentative rules in place, and there are now a couple active legal psilocybin facilitator training programs going on. Some of that training can range in exactly how long it is, but each one needs to be approved and gone through the approval process over the Oregon Health Authority. January 2023, the Oregon Health Authority rules for licensing go into effect, and the applications for administration and manufacturing begin being accepted. So all of the rules were laid out by the Oregon Health Authority, and they are now accepting applications for everything involved in terms of psilocybin administration. So on the manufacturing side of things, any psilocybin administration is going to have to happen within a licensed facility under the supervision of a licensed facilitator, and then everything is going to have to be third-party quality controlled. So they're now accepting applications for all 4 components of that as of early this year. In March 2023, the first cohort of state-sanctioned or state-licensed facilitation training becomes eligible for licensure. Part of the reason I'm giving this talk is I am part of that first cohort, finishing that training up here in about a week and a half, after which I'll be eligible for legal psilocybin facilitation licensure. So a lot of changes over the last few years, especially compared to 1970 when everything got, when all research kind of got shut down. So I want to put a disclaimer out here in terms of this talk and just kind of the CYA component of this talk. So while psilocybin has recently been legalized in the state of Oregon within a supervised clinical context, many areas of the state decided they took a revote after Measure 109 was passed, and there are several counties that have opted out, meaning that they're not going to give out any sort of license for a facility or facilitators to be able to operate, and so it's really interesting. There's a couple websites that have kept track of this. There are some whole counties that opted out, and within those counties there are cities that opted in. So the individual cities decided to go forward with it, even though the county itself has opted out. And then there are counties that remained opted in, but certain cities that individually opted out. So it's accessibility to psilocybin is not going to be a statewide thing for the time being. If going forward as this rolls out, if there are certain areas that don't seem to have psilocybin services, they may have opted out of that. Also, psilocybin remains federally illegal, so that's something to also keep in mind. And is very important, and that the information in this presentation that I'm giving is for educational purposes. We're going to cover some of the research in terms of neurogenesis and some of the fascinating things in terms of neuroplasticity and effects on the brain. But the purpose of this presentation isn't to endorse psilocybin in any way, and certainly isn't intended as any sort of medical advice. So I'm here to inform and hopefully answer any questions you guys have, but this is not any sort of medical advice in any way. So what does psilocybin services look like in Oregon? There are over 200 different mushroom types that produce psilocybin. Within Measure 109 in Oregon, there's one type that can be used as a legal source to be administered, that is Psilocybe cubensis. Everything else is still federally, state, county, city-wide illegal. So Psilocybe cubensis is the only type that will be available. Sessions are mandated to be in 3 phases. And that is based off of protocols established within the university research. So there are preparation sessions where people basically have a thorough consultation, and risks, benefits, questions answered, and all of those things are handled. There's the formal administration session in which psilocybin is administered to the individual. They ingest it. And then there's the third phase of integration, which is something that is mandated to be offered to the individual following any administration session. So that can look like a lot of different things. The facilitator is able to do individual or group integration sessions with an individual. Administration, regardless of dose, and I already mentioned this, but it is going to have to be done within a licensed facility under the supervision of a licensed facilitator. And it can either be done individually or in a group setting. And because of the nature of some of this information down at the bottom, I've got all of my sources here down in blue. So if anybody has any interest and wants to dig into the resources that I'm going to be referencing, it's all right there for you. Right there, that's just going to the state rules and regulations. In terms of what administration may look like, there are a number of different doses of psilocybin that will be potentially administered. So later in the talk, I'm going to reference the term microdose. This is a very small dose of psilocybin that is subhallucinogenic and does not tend to have any sort of loss or change in functionality. Some people will call this subperceptive doses of psilocybin. It's not always the case, because some people will notice some mild changes in perception. Usually it's just kind of an uplifting, it's been described as having a good day feeling. So it's certainly nothing overwhelming, and within the organ laws, depending on what dose you have, an administration session is going to vary in amount of time that somebody has to be there in the facility. So with a microdose, even though it's subhallucinogenic, an individual still needs to be in for at least 30 minutes, 60 minutes for their first session. And then there are higher doses as you go, and as you can see, the higher dose you go, the longer the duration of the administration session. We don't need to necessarily get into a lot of the details of that, so much as just kind of understanding what a microdose is, that it's a subhallucinogenic, very small dose that doesn't impact a person's ability to function or carry on the day or anything like that. So in terms of the nature of this talk and getting into psilocybin and neurogenesis, which I appreciate Dr. Senelik's talk yesterday on neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, and kind of we're going to piggyback on some of that information a little bit. Another term to be familiar with, because it's going to come up later, is psilocin, and that is the metabolite of psilocybin. So what happens, psilocybin is the chemical component that the mushroom produces, and then after it's ingested, the body breaks it down into psilocin, and that is the chemical that has the psychoactive properties. So when I mention psilocin, that's what I'm talking about. It's just psilocybin that's been ingested, broken down, and then is readily available to the body. So animal research, and again, I've got the resources down here if anybody is interested in looking into the details, but animal research both in vivo and in vitro on serotonergic psychedelics, which includes psilocybin. There are a number of other ones, but in this case we're going to stick talking to psilocybin. This just means any sort of psychedelic that has an impact on the serotonin receptors, and we're going to get into detail on some of that. I'm going to try to keep a good balance between, I know this is sort of a mix of clinicians and survivors, and I want to try to provide enough accessible information to both. So I'll do my best in terms of that goes. But with this, again, animal research on serotonergic psychedelics, so any psychedelic that acts on the serotonin receptors, has been shown to demonstrate increases in neuroplasticity. For those who are into this, via TRK8, mTOR, and 5-HT2A receptors. 5-HT means serotonin. 2A, we'll get into the specifics of that in just a minute and what exactly that means. But psilocybin has been shown to upregulate neurogenesis of the axons, the dendrites. It's been shown to upregulate spinogenesis of nerve cells. That's the dendritic spines. Over here on the diagram, you can see the dendrites branch off into these spines that allow for communication between nerve fibers. It's been shown to upregulate synaptogenesis, and it's been shown to increase synapse number and increase the function of the synapses as well. So a lot of interesting research that's been coming out over the last 20 years or so in terms of how this substance has an impact on upregulating nerve and brain function, and we're going to get into some of that. First, let's touch on neurogenesis, and again, I know Dr. Senelik touched on some of this as well, but just different ways that individuals can. On the left, we have the plus, things that upregulate or increase neurogenesis. On the right, things that tend to decrease neurogenesis or have a negative impact on that function. So things that tend to increase: environmental enrichment. Certainly in animal studies, individuals as well, the more enriching that your environment is, the more engaging it is, the more it tends to promote neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. Also, physical activity, exercise is a huge one. So I often tell people, if anything, if you want to upregulate your neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, exercise. That's the way to go. As you get down further, some of these things are not necessarily ways that you would want to experience, but they do in fact upregulate neurogenesis. One is ischemia or hypoxia, so lack of blood, lack of oxygen. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, I'm a functional medicine hyperbaric clinician, and we do hyperbaric medicine for some of our TBI patients. And the hypoxia component includes relative hypoxia. So in situations where you go into hyperbaric and it increases the pressure, and then you come back down from that pressure, it creates what's called relative hypoxia. So your body is in a state of heightened oxygenation and then comes down from that. And that also increases neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, and stem cell production as well. Seizures, trauma, depressants, the drug haloperidol, all seem to upregulate neurogenesis. Again, I'm a licensed acupuncturist. Acupuncture is a micro trauma that doesn't actually cause any harm to the body, but it's penetrating the skin is enough to stimulate the immune system. And so in a lot of my work, that's kind of how we're working on a neurogenesis realm on that end. Things that downregulate neurogenesis: stress, corticosteroids, depression, aging, irradiation, alcohol. Alcohol is going to come back into play here in a couple minutes as well. Psychostimulants and opiates. So there's a relatively new term called a psychoplastogen, and what that means is it's derived from three Greek terms: psych meaning mind, plast meaning molded, and gen as in generate or to produce. So it is a substance that produces a plasticity or a molding of the mind. Basically means that it's producing neuroplasticity. Excuse me. Again, yesterday, Dr. Senelik alluded to the impact that SSRIs, antidepressants, might have on neuroplasticity. And so I'm just going to read the quote here. Compound-induced neuroplasticity, sometimes referred to as eye plasticity, is a well-established phenomenon occurring after treatment with several classes of small molecules. However, most of these compounds, this includes the substances down below, SSRIs, SNRIs, tricyclic antidepressants, most of these compounds act through slow, indirect processes, typically relying on the regulation of neurotropic factors and other proteins. On the other hand, there's these substances known as psychoplastogens, and according to the reference down here, to be classified as a psychoplastogen, a compound should produce a measurable change in plasticity. This changes in neurite growth, dendritic spine density, synapse number, intrinsic excitability, etc., in a very short period of time, usually 24 to 72 hours following a single administration rather than the ongoing chronic administration of the substances above. Because their impact on neuroplasticity enables subsequent stimuli to reshape neural circuits, they should produce relatively long-lasting changes in behavior that extend beyond the acute effects of the drug during the administration of it. So you have these substances that create a noticeable change very quickly and tend to have a long-lasting or an effect following just the administration time or the experience. There are a number of different substances that fall into this category. Most of these are either, one, highly illegal, or two, have a lot of negative side effects or negative effects that you wouldn't really want to experience. But just for people's reference, all of the following are considered psychoplastogens. The tryptamines include psilocin, like we talked about. That's the metabolized psilocybin. Things like DMT, illegal. Ketamine is not illegal, and there's been kind of an upsurge in ketamine clinics. What you run into with ketamine is potential, one, negative experiences, two, misuse. It has a high or fairly high abuse potential. Scopolamine, LSD, obviously illegal. DOI, illegal. MDMA, illegal for the time being. There's a lot, just like psilocybin, there are a lot of university studies being done with MDMA right now, and there's talk of possible rescheduling that over time, especially as it relates to PTSD, but that's a whole other topic. Ibogaine, AZ-A154, rapamycin was a antidepressant that was being studied for a while and showed significant increases in cognitive function, but it's kind of become defunct now. It's not really doing a whole lot, or it's in pharmaceutical limbo at the moment. In terms of safety with psilocybin, so as we talked about before, psilocybin is categorized as a Schedule I substance, meaning by definition that it has a high risk of addiction that's since been shown to be pretty inaccurate. So studies, more recent studies, including the one that I've got the graph for here, have taken a look at various substances and their safety window. And within this study, they looked at all of the listed substances here down along the bottom. If you take a look at the far right end at the bottom, you have mushrooms, that's psilocybin. So of all of the substances that were evaluated, psilocybin had the lowest safety risk. And so you can see there are two different colors up here at the top right. Blue is the potential harm to the user or the individual ingesting the substance. Red is the potential harm to others. And so again, far right, you've got psilocybin down here, and then you kind of work your way to the left. You've got LSD, ecstasy. About midway, you have ketamine, which is about 2.5 times the potential safety risk of psilocybin. And then as you move along, you've got everything from amphetamines to tobacco to cocaine, and then for our left side over here, the highest bar, you've got alcohol, and of course alcohol and its negative effects on or potentiated negative effects, so even greater risk of harm following a TBI. But just to take a look at that scale. Also, I've referenced the bottom one here, the bottom reference, based on a study or reevaluation of safety risks for psilocybin. There are formal papers and recommendations that have been put out about the movement or the proposal to reschedule psilocybin to a Schedule 4 substance, where that would put it is somewhere between over-the-counter cough medicine and anabolic steroids, right at the same level as prescription sleep medication. So time will tell on that, but just in terms of a lot of the more recent safety evaluations, I've got a couple references there for anybody who wants to look into it. Okay, before we get into a little bit more in terms of neurogenesis, we'll talk about some of the red flags and contraindications real quickly. Uncontrolled high blood pressure can definitely be a contraindication for psilocybin use. Psilocybin does mildly upregulate or increase blood pressure. History of seizure, it can lower seizure threshold, so that's a very important one. History of psychosis or schizophrenia, as it can potentiate those, or acute mania, or even hypomania. It can kind of push somebody into a manic state if they're hypomanic. And then acute or sudden life changes or instability, and we're going to talk about some of the effects on the brain networks and how psilocybin works there. But just to keep in mind that any sort of significant instability may be sort of a red flag, and giving high consideration on whether or not psilocybin may be an appropriate approach even within a therapeutic setting, and to keep in that mind that may include a traumatic brain injury. That can certainly be a destabilizing experience. Okay, so let's get into serotonin a little bit, and we'll talk about how psilocybin works on the serotonin receptors and how that impacts neurogenesis. So, as I said before, 5-HT means the same thing as serotonin. Serotonin regulates neurogenesis. We're going to talk about two major serotonin receptors. There are a bunch of different serotonin receptors, but we're going to talk about 5-HT1A and 5-HT2A. So there's 5-HT1, 5-HT3, 5-HT4, 5-HT5, and so on. But we're just going to talk about these two. And we're going to get into, we can get into why we're going to talk about those two. 5-HT1A receptors are those that are primarily impacted by the SSRIs and most of your common antidepressants. 5-HT2A receptors are those that are affected by psilocybin. So 1A receptors, and we're going to use this diagram and then also go over this individually on separate slides, but 5-HT1A receptors basically downregulate the limbic responsivity, or the limbic system's response. That is the more emotional component of the brain, to decrease stress, impulsivity, aggression, and anxiety, while enhancing resilience, patience, emotional blunting, and tolerance to stress. Okay? And here in the diagram, what that's showing is that you can then decrease the symptoms of depression and increase feelings of well-being. So that's kind of a short way of how your SSRI antidepressants work. 5-HT2A receptors work slightly differently. So while 1A receptors work pretty well more locally to the limbic system, 2A receptors are found throughout the cerebral cortex. So it's much more diffuse or a larger brain area that's affected. We'll talk about the term entropy and what that means in a bit, and how that influences or what the psilocybin experience has to do with that. What the 2A receptors tend to do is reduce rigid thinking, reduce pessimism, and increase plasticity, which of course is the topic of this talk. It increases environmental sensitivity. That's another component that can be very important in terms of TBI. Photosensitivity can increase with psilocybin administration, so that can be a key component for a lot of people who may already be photosensitive. It also upregulates or increases learning and the ability to unlearn things, which we'll get into in just a bit as far as unlearning, and increases the ability for adaptability and change. So again, let's go through these individually. The serotonin 1A receptors are modulated by SSRIs, and these are receptors in the limbic system, the stress circuitry or emotional circuitry of the brain, and they promote what's been summarized as passive coping. So this is an ability for resilience in the face of stress, more patient emotional blunting, so it actually downregulates the emotional response. And then a lot of people on SSRIs may be able to tell you sometimes that's emotional blunting of all emotions across the board. So not only depressed emotions, but also some of the more positive emotions as well. So people may often report that. And then increased tolerance of stress. As opposed to the 5-HT1A receptors, which, to be clear, this is not a dig on SSRIs. They're definitely very helpful for many individuals and very important in people's ability to work. So I'm just pointing out the difference in how these things work. Serotonin 2A receptors are modulated by psilocybin and other serotonergic psychedelics, but again, we're sticking to psilocybin. Receptors, again, found throughout the cortex, and it drives key phases of life cortical development, in particular the neocortex. So when an individual is going through key developmental periods of the neocortex and the prefrontal cortex, which is more of your executive function and ability to make judgments and critically think through things. As an individual is developing and that part of the brain is developing, a lot of that is driven by activation of the serotonin 2A receptors. Anyway, as opposed to the passive coping that tends to happen with activation of the serotonin 1A receptors with SSRIs, psilocybin stimulates the receptors that are more involved in active coping. So this is the ability for adaptability, again, learning and unlearning, and actually working through emotions and stress. So rather than blunting them, it can facilitate one's ability to look at and work, acknowledge and work through some of these emotions and stressors, or as we'll get into, traumas in the past. There's a really recent study that shows that this receptor may not even be mediated by serotonin itself, or that it is more impacted by intracellular activation, which promotes dendritic growth and spine density. So the neuroplasticity, neurogenesis component may be more impacted by intracellular or driven by more intracellular activation as opposed to what was previously thought of intercellular activation. So that's just some new research, and again, if anybody's really into it, the resource is there for that to look into. So, in terms of the neuroplasticity effect that we discussed with psilocybin that's been demonstrated by some of the research, how long does it last? What exactly is going on? So, the research is coming out, and it is saying that neuroplastic effects tend to be rapid onset. So again, very, very quickly after administration of psilocybin, and that it's showing enduring improvements for up to 30 days following administration. And again, I'm just going to read through this real quick. The papers say the expression of plasticity-related genes and proteins, including brain-derived neurotrophic factor (BDNF), is changed after a single administration of psychedelics, resulting in changed neuroplasticity. The latter included more dendritic complexity, which outlasted the acute effects of the psychedelic. So again, lasted more than just the psychedelic experience itself. Repeated administration of a psychedelic directly stimulated neurogenesis and increased BDNF MRA levels up to a month after treatment. A hypothesis that psychedelics may remove the brakes on adult neuroplasticity, inducing a state similar to that of early my word, but neurodevelopment. Again, these receptors drive the developments of the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex. And what they're saying here is that there is currently a hypothesis that these stimulation of the serotonin 2A receptors might actually remove breaks that occur later in life that slow down neuroplasticity. In that study, they highlighted ocular dominance plasticity in the visual system as a model of characterizing critical periods in the limbic system relevant to psychiatry. So that's what they took a look at in terms of evaluating what sort of neuroplasticity or whether or not neuroplasticity was happening. There's a forthcoming study that's not even released yet, so I don't have a reference on that. But again, anybody who's really into this can keep an eye out for that. But the study is showing that diffusivity of white matter cabling, or axial diffusivity, excuse me. So what happens is as we get older, the white matter cabling becomes more diffuse or less entangled. And what this forthcoming study is showing or showed is that what would be considered a medium dose, or 25 milligrams of psilocybin, decreased up to 1 month, decreased that axial diffusivity for up to a month after psilocybin in healthy people. This did not show up at all in a very low dose of psilocybin. So basically what that means is that the white matter cabling was better able to communicate and was less diffuse within this study. So hopefully that'll be out soon and we can really dig into some of the details of that. Let's talk about the hippocampus a little bit. The hippocampus is kind of the memory center of the brain, and also one of the few or two areas of the brain that continues neuroplasticity, or neurogenesis, excuse me, throughout the adult life. So here it says it plays a critical role in learning tasks that involve temporal encoding. What that means is being able to process time sequence of things happening, so things happening over time. That's relevant because there's a term called trace conditioning. This is a form of classical conditioning in which the presentation of conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is separated in time. So the ability to perceive that something happened before and then something happened after and there was time in between. What you run into in PTSD is that can break down at times, and so people will have these reliving experiences where the present time is really no different from the trauma in the past. So lesions in the hippocampus can prevent this trace conditioning, this ability to separate these things by time. Aberration in the serotonin system can alter trace conditioning, and the serotonin 2A receptors that we're talking about that are affected by psilocybin are involved in temporal, or again, space-time encoding that stimulate the GABA interneurons for temporospatial integration. In terms of neurogenesis, like I said, the hippocampus was one of the few areas that continues neurogenesis regularly throughout the adult life in order to kind of create memories. That's through the dentate gyrus. We don't need to get into a lot of the neuroscience of that, but just for people's reference who are really into that, there it is. A study showed that chronic administration of serotonin agonists upregulate BDNF MRA expression in the hippocampus. So serotonin stimulation upregulates BDNF, and thus upregulates the ability for the hippocampus to form memories and keep that that trace conditioning separation in time. In a psilocybin study, trace fear conditioning tests, psilocybin was shown to enhance adaptation to unwanted stimulus. That means that the extinction of fear conditioning was facilitated by the psilocybin treatment, and thus may have an application in PTSD by facilitating the extinction of the history of fear conditioning or the trauma response. Also, I've got this on full screen, so I can't see any questions right now, but if there are any pressing questions, feel free to jump in and let me know, because I'm happy to, or if I lose somebody. The 5-HT2A receptors specifically, so the serotonin 2A receptors, again, those that are affected by psilocybin, have a direct effect on the hippocampus. So they are abundant in the hippocampus. There are a lot of them. They are involved in cell proliferation in the hippocampus. And an animal study referenced below showed that a low, or again, microdose here, so a not subperceptive necessarily, but subhallucinogenic dose that does not impact function or inhibit one's ability to function, that repeated administration of microdosing demonstrated the highest degree of neurogenesis, as opposed to higher doses of psilocybin that were actually shown to inhibit neurogenesis, but increased neural connectivity, which we'll get into in the next slide. This was verified through using a serotonin 2A antagonist. Ketanserin was used, and this blocked the neuronal proliferation, meaning that when ketanserin was administered, it slowed down or stopped the neurogenesis effect that they were seeing with the psilocybin administration. Increased variance in amplitude fluctuations in hippocampus post-psilocybin were also found. That just means that the hippocampus was basically more active. So key takeaway here was that low microdosing of psilocybin was shown to have the greatest effect on neurogenesis, and that it was shown that it was a direct effect of the serotonin 2A receptor. So in terms of neural connectivity, that's a whole other component that was here shown to be changed more with the higher dose. And what the research is showing in terms of brain connectivity and integration is, if you see many talks or listen to many talks on psilocybin, you've probably seen or will see this diagram. What it's showing is, on the left is a depiction of brain communication throughout the brain while prior to psilocybin administration. So this is baseline, quote-unquote, normal brain communication. And then the one on the right is what was found during or post psilocybin administration. And as you can see, there's a lot more going on here. So basically what they've been finding is, as it lists here, communication becomes much more global throughout the brain. So you have portions of the brain that were not talking to one another before and are now talking, and a lot of those lines of communications have been strengthened. So there's more communication happening at a much wider level throughout the brain globally. And I'll just read the quote real quick. The two key results of the analysis of the study summarized as below. There is an increased integration between cortical regions in the psilocybin state, and that this integration is supported by a persistent scaffold of a set of edges that support cross-modular connectivity, probably as a result of the stimulation of the serotonin 2A receptors in the cortex. So this is a huge change in what's going on in the brain during the psilocybin experience. In terms of studies on brain networks,
Can I ask you a question about that? I love that picture. Is that an image of one cell, or is that just a way to exemplify the change?
No, that's a depiction of the change. So they took all of the data and then turned it into this diagram. So each one of the little dots around the perimeter is a different brain region, and then each line that's going from one dot or circle to another, and the size of the dot is the amount of communication that's happening. So you're seeing a lot more sense. Yeah, a lot more brain areas, and then a lot more lines going to different areas. That's showing that the communication is happening between one area and another area. It's definitely not a single cell. It's a global depiction of what was going on in the brain.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so brain networks. Psilocybin has been shown to have a fairly significant impact on the default mode network. It's been shown to actually downregulate the function in the default mode network. Well, this is a set of brain regions that tend to be associated with things like self-reflection, introspection, theory of mind, mental time travel. So the ability to look back and look forward, or think back and think forward. There has also been association with kind of, again, that self-reflection, introspection, a sense of self type thing, and an association with what we would call the ego. And so with this, as I said, psilocybin is shown to downregulate the default mode network. And when people describe like ego dissolution or ego death, it's been postulated that that's what they're experiencing is a decoupling of the default mode network with other brain regions, and this downregulation of the default mode network. So Richard Dawes, and I've got his study down below if anybody wants to reference it, but he has laid out this depiction of kind of what happens with the psilocybin experience in terms of depression. And so the picture on the left is meant to depict a landscape in the case of depression, and you've got a lot of ups and you've got a lot of downs, and you've got areas that there's just a lot going on there as a result of past experience. And then the middle picture depicts what the administration of psilocybin tends to do, and that is flatten out that landscape. So during the psilocybin administration, it says here, it opens up the rigidity of the depressed to allow for new thoughts, insights, and perspectives to emerge. So it kind of not exactly creates a clean slate, but creates a much smoother landscape in which one can experience a different state. And then post-treatment, what they found was that landscape after the experience itself loses a lot of those big valleys and mountains, and it sort of evens things out. So it's just like any other physiotherapy treatment, like I'll do for a lot of people. If somebody has an ongoing chronic condition, you're not necessarily going to undo everything that's been happening, but if people are able to make a step in progress, it can initiate the ability for significant change. And that's kind of what they're showing here in cases of depression and leveling out that landscape a little bit. Let's see, how are we doing? Okay. I know I'm about out of time, so real quickly, how does this apply to brain injury, since this is a conference on that? So one study showed recent in vitro, in vivo, and case report studies suggest that psychedelic pharmacotherapies may influence the future of brain treatment through the modulation of neuroinflammation, which wasn't even something that we got onto, but is a really fascinating field in terms of its potential impact on chronic pain conditions and functional pain conditions. That's via the systemic serotonin 2A receptors that are throughout the body, through hippocampal neurogenesis that we talked about, through neuroplasticity that we touched on, and through the brain complexity and that global connection and communication that happens. So big emphasis here for the research is needed to determine the optimal timing after an injury, route of administration for neuroprotective effects, whether it's even appropriate following a TBI. It really depends on where somebody may be. So unfortunately, TBI is often an exclusionary condition in studies that are being done. So as we move into the future and more studies open up and there's more federal funding or funding of studies, there may be more ability to explore this component within the realm of brain injury more. But for the time, studies are very limited. So there are self-reports. I don't have the resource listed here, but you can look up microdose psilocybin self-reporting, and there are big self-report studies that have been done of people just chiming in about their experience, and those do seem to have potential promise, but that still very much remains to be seen. And then special considerations on cases of TBI and whether it's even appropriate. So interesting things going on. Lots of things to still kind of see where the future takes. But that's about it. I've included most of the citations and resources here again, so if anybody's interested, this is my contact. So if you want to email me for questions, slides, more information, or whatever, that is my website. There are a few of my books, and I think that's my time.